When the war finally ended for them, the silence felt unnatural. After years of thunderous artillery, endless commands shouted in German, and the ever-present fear of death, the stillness of the American plains felt wrong. The train stopped with a metallic groan somewhere in Texas, and the German prisoners of war, most barely in their 20s, were ordered to step out. They expected shouting, dogs, maybe the cold eyes of guards with rifles ready. But instead, they saw open sky, sunlight, and Americans smiling? The camp wasn't made of barbed nightmares like those in Europe. Instead, it was clean, organized, and strangely calm. One of the soldiers, Hans Mueller, wrote years later, "We thought we were brought here to be humiliated, maybe even starved. But when they gave us soap, coffee, and bread, I thought either this is a trick or America is not what we were told." Their first morning began not with drills, but with breakfast, eggs, potatoes, and even milk. For men who had eaten rats and stale bread on the Eastern Front, it was unbelievable. The guards didn't yell, they talked. Some even cracked jokes. And yet, there was still tension, that silent unease that comes when men are too afraid to believe what they see. Rumors spread fast in the camp. Someone said they'd be sent to work in cotton fields. Another claimed they'd be part of some military training demonstration for American officers. Then, one morning, an American sergeant shouted through the yard, his accent heavy and cheerful, "Boys, we're taking y'all to see some action today." The Germans stiffened. Action? They exchanged nervous glances. Were they about to be moved to a training facility? A firing range? As they lined up outside the trucks, the air buzzed with speculation. Vielleicht testen sie uns. Maybe they're testing us. Oder sie wollen uns demütigen. Or maybe they want to humiliate us. But when the trucks finally rolled out of the camp, they didn't head toward any military base. The road stretched through the golden Texas plains, dotted with barns and fields, until in the distance they saw crowds, flags, and something that looked like a wooden arena. A smell of dust, horses, and roasted corn filled the air. People were laughing, cheering, waving hats. The prisoners stared, confused. One of them whispered, "Was ist das? Training?" Another replied with disbelief, "Nein, das ist America." When the truck stopped, the Germans climbed out into blinding sunlight. The air vibrated with noise, not of gunfire, but of cheers. Thousands of Americans filled the stands, waving flags, laughing, calling out names. The prisoners blinked, trying to understand where they were. A sign over the entrance read, "Texas State Rodeo, welcome cowboys." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then someone muttered, almost whispering, "Cowboys? Like in the movies?" They had seen posters back home. John Wayne, wild horses, dust, and open plains. But to see it alive, right before their eyes, after the filth and chaos of war, it didn't feel real. Guards guided them to a section of the stands. There were no rifles pointed at them, no chains. They were told to sit. A few men looked around nervously, as if it were a trap. But then, the gates burst open. A bull exploded into the arena, muscles rippling, foam flying from its nostrils. A man, lean, fearless, wearing a hat, clung to its back as the beast bucked and twisted under him. The crowd roared. For a heartbeat, every German soldier froze. The violence of it, the raw energy, reminded them of battle. But this time, the violence was turned into entertainment. It wasn't death, it was life, danger transformed into applause. Then something inside them cracked. Someone laughed. It started quietly. One short, nervous chuckle from the back row. Then another joined in, and another. Soon the air was full of laughter, rough, foreign, alive. For the first time in years, they weren't soldiers. They weren't enemies. They were just men, watching another man fight a bull in a world where no one was trying to kill them. Hans, the same soldier who once thought the coffee was a trick, wrote later, "I didn't understand at first. I thought this must be some strange military display. But when the bull won and the cowboy got up laughing, I realized these people fight not for survival, but for joy." Between events, American children approached the POW section, curious, fearless. A little girl waved and handed one prisoner a Coca-Cola bottle through the fence. He stared at it like it was a holy relic. The label was bright red, the glass cold. He didn't drink it immediately, he just held it, smiling. And in that simple gesture, a child giving a prisoner a Coke. The war ended, at least for a few seconds. By evening, the sky turned orange over the arena. The smell of popcorn mixed with the dust. Some prisoners clapped along with the crowd. Others sat in silence, lost in thought, watching the American flag flutter in the warm wind. They didn't know yet what freedom truly meant. But that day, sitting in a Texas rodeo, they got their first glimpse of it. And it was louder, happier, and stranger than they ever imagined. The trucks rolled back toward the camp as the sun melted into the Texas horizon. The prisoners sat in silence, the smell of dust and cattle still clinging to their uniforms. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played, carried on the warm evening wind. For the first time in months, maybe years, none of them wanted to talk about the war. No one mentioned Hitler or orders or duty. They just stared out the truck's open sides, watching the fields fade into shadow. Inside one truck, a few men spoke quietly. "Did you see how they laughed?" one said. "Even when the bull threw the man, they cheered for him." "They cheer for failure," another muttered. Back home, failure meant punishment. That sentence hung in the air. They realized how foreign this idea was. To lose and still be celebrated. To risk, not because you're ordered to, but because you choose to. When they reached the camp, the guards didn't yell or bark commands. They just opened the gates and told them to rest. A few Americans were still smiling, asking, "So, how'd y'all like it?" One German simply nodded, not sure what to say. How do you explain to your captor that you've just seen a world you didn't know could exist? That night, the barracks were full of whispers. Some couldn't stop talking about the bull, the music, the children, the laughter. Others sat quietly, wrestling with thoughts they didn't want to admit. Hans wrote in his journal that evening, "They told us America was a nation of criminals and savages. But I saw children giving food to prisoners. I saw joy, not fear. And for the first time, I wondered if everything we believed was wrong." In another corner, an older prisoner named Friedrich spoke softly to his bunkmate. "You know, my wife wrote that she hides in cellars during bombings. My son's school was destroyed. I thought the enemy was responsible for that pain. But now I see they have no hatred in their eyes." His bunkmate didn't answer. He just stared at the ceiling, listening to the crickets outside. In the following days, something began to change in the camp. The guards noticed it too. The Germans seemed calmer, less suspicious. They worked with less resentment, laughed more often. Some even began to learn English words, asking how to say thank you, good morning, or friend. One guard wrote later, "They stopped looking at us like we were monsters, and I think they stopped feeling like prisoners." Evenings often ended with small conversations through the fence. An American farmer talking about his crops, a German soldier describing his home near the Rhine. They exchanged stories, drawings, even small gifts. The rodeo had done more than entertain them. It cracked something open. It showed them a world where strength didn't come from cruelty, and pride didn't mean fear. In a war built on lies and hate, a single afternoon of laughter had done what bombs and speeches never could. It made enemies feel human again. And though none of them knew it yet, that simple day in Texas would follow them for the rest of their lives, through repatriation, through broken cities, through decades of silence. For many, when they later spoke of America, they didn't mention the guards or the fences. They said one word: rodeo. Weeks passed after the rodeo, but the memory refused to fade. For the German prisoners, life in the Texas camp had fallen into rhythm: morning work, meals, quiet evenings. But something was different now. The laughter they'd seen, the colors, the music. It had carved a mark in their minds that wouldn't heal. They started writing more letters home. Before, their words were dry, mechanical, lists of tasks, requests for news, the same cautious phrases: "I am alive," "I am healthy." But now, new sentences began to appear. "The Americans treat us well," one wrote. "We have food, real food. They even gave us soap and clean clothes." Another added, "There is no hatred here, no shouting. It feels strange." Some of these letters were intercepted or censored, their softer words blacked out by thick ink. The German authorities didn't want families back home to read that the enemy was showing kindness. It didn't fit the story the Reich wanted to tell. Still, a few made it through. And for mothers, wives, and sisters reading those letters in bombed-out houses back in Germany, they were like messages from another world, a world that still had decency left in it. One day, Hans Müller, the same soldier who once couldn't believe the Americans gave him coffee, sat down to write again. The paper was thin, the pencil dull, but the words came easily this time. "Dear Mother, I have seen something today that I cannot explain. They took us to a place called a rodeo. It is not war, it is madness, but in a joyful way. Men fight bulls and people laugh and no one dies. The children wave and even the losers smile. I did not think such a place could exist. I think I am beginning to understand what peace feels like." He folded the paper carefully, sealing it with the American-issued envelope that read, "Prisoner of War Mail." It was strange. A letter written by a captured enemy, delivered safely by the very people he was taught to hate. Inside the camp, more subtle changes appeared. A small group of POWs started drawing sketches of the rodeo, the cowboys, the crowd. They pinned them on the wall of the barracks, and others added to them: a child with a balloon, an American flag, a bull mid-jump. It was their way of keeping that memory alive. Some even began to play music again, a harmonica passed between hands. They didn't know the American songs, but they tried to mimic the rhythm they remembered from that day: the beat of hooves, the roar of the crowd, the sound of freedom. But not all could accept it. A few men stayed distant, angry even. "Don't let them fool you," one said bitterly. "It's just propaganda." Another replied softly, "Maybe, but if this is propaganda, it feels better than hate." Those quiet words carried more power than any speech. because deep down, everyone in that camp knew something had changed. The line between enemy and human had blurred. By the end of that summer, the American officers noticed that the prisoners had begun to volunteer for small tasks: cleaning, gardening, helping in kitchens. They were no longer driven by fear, but by gratitude. And at night, when the lights dimmed, you could sometimes hear a voice humming an American tune, soft, uncertain, but full of something that had been missing since the war began: hope. Thousands of miles away, in ruined cities across Germany, families read the censored fragments of those letters. They didn't know what a rodeo was. They couldn't picture the bulls or the dust or the laughter, but they understood one thing: their sons were still alive, and maybe, somewhere far away, they had found a small piece of peace. By the time 1946 arrived, the war had long ended, but for the prisoners in Texas, the end still felt unreal. Repatriation orders began to arrive, lists of names read out loud in the camp yard. Men packed their few belongings: a Bible, a photo, a wooden carving, a Coca-Cola bottle they'd kept as a souvenir. For many, that bottle was proof that kindness could exist even in captivity. They didn't cheer when their names were called. They stood quietly, looking around the camp one last time: the barracks, the kitchen, the fences that no longer felt like prison walls. A few American guards came to shake hands, smiling awkwardly. "Take care, fellas," one said. "Guess the war's finally over, huh?" For some of the Germans, that simple handshake meant more than any victory ever had. It was the moment they realized they weren't enemies anymore, just men trying to move forward from a nightmare. The journey home was slow and uncertain. The ships back to Europe were crowded with silence, thousands of men staring at the endless gray of the Atlantic, wondering what waited for them. Germany was no longer the land they'd left. Cities were rubble, families scattered, and the Reich they'd sworn to serve had vanished like smoke. When they arrived, many found themselves strangers in their own country. Some were shunned for having surrendered. Others returned to ruins and graves. But a few carried something different: not bitterness, but perspective. In small towns across Germany, stories began to spread, quiet, almost whispered. The Americans were not what we thought. They gave us food. They gave us dignity. They even took us to a rodeo. Neighbors didn't believe it at first. How could the enemy who bombed their homes treat their soldiers with compassion? But the men who'd been there spoke with a calm that no propaganda could fake. They had seen the other side, and it wasn't full of monsters. Hans Müller's last letter, written months after returning home, read, "I used to believe strength meant obedience. I learned that real strength is mercy. I saw laughter instead of hatred, freedom instead of fear. I saw that even after war, people can choose kindness." He kept a small drawing of the Texas rodeo pinned above his bed until the day he died, a reminder that even in captivity, he had seen something no victory could bring him: humanity. In later years, historians would call it a psychological victory. The U.S. didn't just defeat Germany's army, it dismantled its ideology, one act of decency at a time. A sandwich, a smile, a bottle of Coke. These simple gestures became quiet weapons against hatred. For the men who once wore the uniform of an empire built on fear, that rodeo was the first day of freedom. Not freedom from barbed wire, but freedom from the lies that had chained their minds. And so, when they spoke of the war in their old age, they didn't talk about battles or medals. They talked about sunlight in Texas, the roar of a crowd, the taste of Coca-Cola, and the day they finally laughed again. That was how peace began. Not in a treaty or surrender, but in a dusty arena where former enemies sat side by side and remembered what it meant to be human. Years later, when those men were old and gray, people would sometimes ask them about the war. They didn't like to talk about it. They spoke little of the battles, the front lines, or the orders. But when they did talk, it wasn't about fighting. It was about that strange sunlit day in Texas. Some called it the day the world stopped being divided, because for a few hours there were no uniforms, no enemies, no fear, just laughter and dust in the air. Historians would later say that what America did with its prisoners was one of the quiet victories of the war. Instead of breaking them, they showed them a different way to live. Instead of revenge, they offered dignity. And that, in its own way, was far more powerful than any weapon. After the war, many of those former prisoners became voices of reason in their communities. When hatred began to rise again, they were the ones who said, "No, I've seen the other side." They told their children about farms and kindness, not propaganda and hate, about cowboys and bulls instead of bombs and guns. A few even returned to America years later as visitors, not captives. They stood in those same plains, older now, calmer, and watched the wind sweep across the empty arenas. One of them said softly to his grandson, "This is where I learned that freedom isn't given by force, it's shared." In museums and archives, there are still old photos, smiling POWs at camp, an American guard handing out soda, a crowd watching a rodeo. At first glance, they look ordinary, but behind those smiles lies something extraordinary, proof that even after the darkest war in history, light could still break through. That moment in Texas didn't end the war, but it began something else, a quiet revolution of the human spirit. It showed that the greatest victory isn't when you defeat your enemy, it's when you refuse to become like him. When the last of those men passed away, the letters they'd written from captivity were found in drawers and attics, yellowed, folded, but carefully kept. Most ended the same way. "I am alive. I am treated well. I have hope." Those simple words carried across oceans, through ruins, through generations. They were more than sentences. They were evidence that even in war, decency could survive. And perhaps, when humanity needed it most, that day at a Texas rodeo reminded the world of something it had almost forgotten, that mercy is stronger than fear, that kindness can outlive hate, and that peace, in the end, doesn't come from treaties, but from the courage to see your enemy as human